All right, everybody, we are going to get started. We'll allow people to just trickle in as they come, and we'll hopefully I'll be able to multitask as we do that. So just wanted to start off with welcoming everybody for Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism, our racial equity movie night tonight with R.A.R.E, Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity. And I want to start off by giving some acknowledgements, and then we'll do introductions and kind of dive into the Q&As that we have in regards to the film. Don't worry if you have not watched the film, you'll still be able to go back and watch it. Nothing that we'll be talking about today will keep you from being able to engage in the discussion. So we'll kick it off. I want to give our land acknowledgement. I'm currently in Louisiana right now. I'm not in Seattle, so my land acknowledgement is going to be a little different. But I would like to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Caddo, Yatasi, Huapa, and Osage tribes, and that I occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Native and Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land that I am on. A little different down here than it is in Seattle. Seattle, I think being able to build relationships with people in the different Native communities has been accessible for me up there, and it's a little bit different here. So I'm trying to find different ways to engage with the communities here. So my land acknowledgement isn't just a statement that I'm making, but that I'm able to put some tangible solidarity behind that and talk about the relationships that I have with community. So I want to honor those people and honor the Coast Salish people as well, as all of you are beaming in from Seattle. We always give an emotional labor acknowledgement at SACA during our meetings, and that's because we're in a mixed race cohort. And we want to make sure that we're in agreement to hold the weight of emotional labor together. So emotional labor is the need for one group to regulate their emotions to satisfy another group, usually the group holding the most power. We want to acknowledge the diversity present and not present in this virtual space. We want to make sure that we are also acknowledging the role that white folks hold and inherently holding more power in our current social system. We also want to recognize that the folks of color in this space are inherently carrying the abundance of emotional labor, both in this room and on a daily basis as they navigate the world, many of them navigating multiple systems of oppression. We thank and honor those that do that emotional labor, and we agree not to exploit it. We acknowledge the need to hold this emotional labor as a group, and it is a goal for this space for folks that do not tend to hold the weight of emotional labor to accept the complexity and pervasiveness of emotional labor. So thank you for sharing in that space with me. So R.A.R.E, Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity. A little bit about R.A.R.E in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the upheaval that followed, Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity was formed by a multi-ethnic group of Roosevelt High School alumni to discuss racism, both in America and in Seattle. And their mission is to advocate for racial equity by contributing to a deeper understanding of racism and racial equity, to heal the racial divide, and to enhance equitable outcomes for all people. I'm so excited and honored to share space with the people here that we have today from R.A.R.E. And what I think is so special and important is that you're an intergenerational collective. You are a mixed race collective. You have different experiences, from having gone to Roosevelt High School 50 years ago to being at Roosevelt now, to being the perspective of a parent. And I think that the arts and culture sector and the people here have a lot to learn from your experience. So I just wanted to give a couple of introductions of who we have here today. So Joe Hunter, Roosevelt Alumni and R.A.R.E co-chair. Joe was born and raised in Seattle Central area and currently lives in the Beacon Hill area, which ranks 18th of 14,844 communities in the county based on its racial, its racial diversity. In 1968, Joe and 10 of his classmates were asked by a counselor to attend Roosevelt High School as part of Seattle's voluntary transfer program. His attendance at RHS was meaningful and helped in his early development and learning how to navigate America's racial culture. R.A.R.E has given Joe an opportunity to collaborate with his high school classmates to change the racial climate at Roosevelt High School and hopefully to make meaningful change towards racial equity. Joe has a BA from WWSU in business administration and has held several executive level management positions in merchandising, operations, and HR. In the past, he has served on the boards of Orange County, California Urban League, the University of Illinois School of Business. Early in his career, he was instrumental in establishing a minority networking conference in the western part of the country for his former company, and he is now retired. And before coronavirus, he was a volunteer basketball coach at Seattle's High Point Park Department. So honored to have Joe here. We have Leah Scott, who's a student. Leah is a passionate youth advocate dedicated to creating innovative opportunities to uplift and empower youth in underserved communities. She's a transfer student at the University of Washington, studying political science and law, aspiring to attend law school after her BA. She specializes in methodically and intentionally balancing critical thought and practical action to achieve systemic reformations regarding prominent social issues. Illustrated through her work in the Seattle Times and the R.A.R.E documentary, Leah is a community-rooted activist with a fiery fervor for education, social justice, and equity. So glad to have Leah here. Natalya Yudkovsky is a parent. Natalya was born in 1974 in St. Petersburg, Russia, grew up in New York City, and has lived in Seattle for over 26 years. She has a PhD in molecular and cellular biology, better her than myself, from the University of Washington, and has done research in the field of immunology at the Institute for Systems Biology. For the past 10 years, Natalya has been very active as a volunteer at public schools in Northeast Seattle, on local PTSAs, and with the Washington State PTA. She's been the advocacy chair on the PTSAs at Exstein Middle School and Roosevelt High School, and the WSPTA Region 6 Advocacy Co-Chair, advocating for the needs of our schools, children, and families at the local and state level. This includes testifying in the Washington State Legislature in support of fully funding our state's basic education system and in support of increasing access to dual credit programs in high school. She is currently the PTSA president of Roosevelt High School and a member of the WSPTA Advocacy Committee, which reviews the grassroots submissions provided by members to create the WSPTA legislative platform and helps organize the WSPTA advocacy in the state level. Natalya has 2 children, one currently attending Roosevelt and one who graduated from Roosevelt just this summer. She enjoys traveling, hiking, and kayaking with her children and her husband. So happy to have you here, Natalya. And last but not least, we have Quincy Purcell, who is a senior at Roosevelt High School. He's participated in racial equity for 2 years on his school's PTSA Racial Equity Committee and as a student ambassador for the Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity, also known as R.A.R.E. Racial equity work allows him to give back to his community and help create the changes in racial equity that need to happen. I'm so excited again to have all of you here. And thank you for being willing to chat with us and to share just what you have learned throughout this process that you've been in. And I'm so interested in the perspective that you'll bring, again, as an intergenerational mixed race collective. So thank you again for being here. One of the first questions I kind of wanted to start off with was one of the questions you had in your discussion guide, which I thought was a good kind of launch point for us to kick off the conversation. But to what extent are the issues of racial equity today the same as they were 50 years ago? And then what is different? So thinking about what is the same and what is different as they were, you know, Joe, back in your day when you were in high school. Natalya, I'm sure you've had a wild experience too, having been born in Russia, lived in New York, been back in Seattle. What are those big differences and how are they different to today? And you can all kind of chime in on that question, but wanted to pose that.
I guess since I'm the oldest, I'll talk about how it was when I was in school over 50 years ago. I think looking back 50 years ago and, being a 16, 17-year-old young man, And looking at the young people today, they're a lot more aware of the issues that are out there, from a racial standpoint than I think I was and my classmates at the time. I think the a lot of the issues just getting people used to other people, regardless if it's the difference is your race, the difference is your sex, or difference in your religion or whatever. I still think there's a challenge there, because I think that as people grow up, they get used to or comfortable in the environment that they're in. And if that environment is all white, or if that environment is all one religion or whatever, then you become comfortable with it, and that becomes your norm, or your line of your standard that you look at and compare everything to. Not to mean that it's right, but that's what you use because that's what you're used to. So I think from a racial equity standpoint, there are a lot of things that are kind of the same as what they were 50 years ago. So yeah.
Yeah, Natalya, do you have any a perspective to add to that?
Well, a personal perspective, I'm obviously white. So the understanding of race and racial issues in my life has been very gradual. I have to say that when I think back to what things were like in my childhood was growing up in New York City in the 80s, the 1980s. And I went to some very diverse schools. I had a lot of friends who were different races and different religions. And I felt like as I kind of progressed, as I got older, I actually ended up being in more and more kind of white environments. So in college, there was still a relative amount of diversity, but it was starting to narrow. And then in graduate school, it started to narrow. And then I went, for grad school, I came to Seattle, and I ended up living near the University of Washington because it was convenient. And so that's Northeast Seattle, which is where I stayed. And I ended up being in this very, very white environment with, a little bit of Asian mixed in. And so it was very eye-opening for me to move out here. I got, like, as Joe was saying, I really got used to that environment. That became my standard. And so then when I would go back to New York to visit my family, it was always very jarring. Like, oh, okay, like, yes, the world is bigger. There's more different kinds of people from different kinds of places. So I definitely think that because of that, my ideas about race and impacts of race and racism have really widened over the years, in terms of recognizing what people's struggles are and have been. I was much more as a child aware of immigrant struggles, because a lot of my friends were also immigrants, and so that those struggles in some ways are similar, but in some ways are different. So
yeah, thank you for sharing those perspectives. I think it's easy when you move about the world in a different body, you're going to, of course, notice people that are like you, right? And maybe in some situations not notice when there's not difference surrounding you when you're in community. So those completely make sense. And I hear what you're saying too, Joe, around it does seem like this next generation that's coming up is just more, at least more willing to have conversations about like that's what happened back in your day when you're older, right? Are able to see through that a little bit more. And Leah and Quincy, I'm interested to hear your perspective too. Like, how do you think that things are the same as they were 50 years ago? And then how do you think that they're different now?
Well, I guess I can start. Obviously I'm only 17, so I wasn't alive 50 years ago. But I have taken history classes, and I've learned about Joe's experiences, and I've watched the documentary, which you should watch if you haven't. But I think that it really, to me, comes down to the difference between I think that the idea of racism rooted in taking advantage of Black people in America is really, that idea has just been so ingrained in society in every single institution. And I don't think that idea is gone at all. In fact, I think in some ways, the fact that it's more, it's harder to parse out now makes it even more dangerous, because we're not able to target that, what we can do to change that. I mean, we are, but it's more difficult. So really, I think it comes down to, during the civil rights movement in the 60s, I think that was really kind of where the acts of like direct physical aggression, I think that was where people started to like kind of specifically white people started to realize that that was a big issue and it wasn't right, and all these things. So there was kind of like this unanimous, or not unanimous, but there was a struggle, and the people that the activists ended up winning that struggle to a certain extent, right? So obviously it could have gone farther, but they kind of established this kind of new kind of norm where, okay, it's not okay to beat up a random Black person on the street. Like, that is like morally wrong. So once that was established, like we kind of moved on. But today you still see these same ideas, and while they may not be as direct as that physical action, they're still, impactful. So in terms of like systemic inequities, obviously, the pay gap. One thing that I find interesting is mental health. It's not really Black folks tend to just have issues with mental health based on statistics. Like that's a real tangible impact that we can just pinpoint. And I think that, we need to be everyone needs to be kind of aware of those, and so that when they come up, it's not like a surprise, like, oh, I didn't know that, or like, oh, I didn't know that was an impact of what happened 100 years ago. So I really think that's how it's changed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Quincy, what about you, Leah?
Yeah, a lot of the things that I kind of would have said have been a little bit said, but I can add on just a bit more. Obviously, I wasn't alive 50 years ago, but I can add on in the sense that some of the issues that we had 50 years ago are still prevalent and persisting today, particularly I would say around misinformation. I think that's very, very key, especially if you have Gen Z who is very, very active. We are very, very active community when it comes to Generation Z, and talking about various different social issues, what that means for our political process. You saw a lot of people in Generation Z now being able to vote now, so that's a really big turnout as well. So I think misinformation plays a key role in this, in terms of how we talk about these social issues and how that translate into Generation Z's leadership. I think that we need to have a big kind of discussion around what tools and frameworks are we using to actually help marginalized communities, if that's Generation Z's goal, and how can we efficiently help these communities. I think too often Generation Z kind of goes in really hot and then doesn't kind of think of all sides of the situation. And I've been there 100%. So I think that what's really helpful is having discussions like these that are multi-generational, from people who've been a part of the civil rights movement, who've seen the effective ways to have and create social change, and then using those same frameworks and tweaking them for the next generation. I think that's always helpful. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think what you're sharing, again, that I don't see a lot of like mixed race, intergenerational community organizing. When it comes to that, we're always going to have blind spots based on the way that we move about the world, like how old we are, what we look like, how the world interacts with us, whatever our life experiences have been, where do we grow up. And so I think it's really beautiful to create something that is intergenerational, that is mixed race. And one of the things that there was a quote in the movie that I thought was powerful, and I don't remember who said it, but hate is easier to organize than understanding. And I would love to hear your thoughts on why do you think that is, and how do we combat that tension in order for us to move forward in recognizing even R.A.R.E.'s mission, which is racial equity throughout our community, our city, and our country. We're very polarized right now. Not that we haven't always been as a country, but we see it now because of social media, because of technology. It's in our face. We see it all the time, especially if you move out the world as a non-Black person. Maybe you're just becoming aware of like how bad things are. Or if you grew up in the South, like me, coming to Seattle was like, oh, you guys are just quiet about it here. Down here, I know you don't like trans people, you don't like Black people, you don't like gay people. Great. I thank you for telling me. I won't come anywhere near you. In Seattle, it's different. You're constantly second guessing. Was that racism? Was it not? And that gaslighting that we can do to ourselves is so harmful. So when I heard that quote, hate is easier to organize than understanding, it just made me want to hear from all of you of how do we combat that tension?
I don't know. I wanted to piggyback on something that you just said that really helped develop me and my understanding of racism, prejudice, biases, and so forth. I lived, born and raised here in Seattle, but I left Seattle for 25 years. And I moved to Southern California, and there it was predominantly, it was a mix, between Hispanics, whites, Blacks, and whatever, but pretty diverse. Okay, but it was a different culture. Okay, I've worked in Texas, and if you're familiar with Texas, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, where 99% of the population is Hispanic, El Paso, whatever, and I've gone there. And I didn't feel any different. I wasn't looked upon as different. At least that was the way I was feeling. Okay. And I've gone to East Texas, and East Texas is probably, if not the birthplace of the Klan, it's probably the next birthplace or whatever. Louisiana down there, people know each other. Okay. They may not, they know each other's family, whatever. It's a different relationship, white, Black, and what have you there. Totally different. And I was watching how that was going on, but it was totally different. Now, there's some other, I don't know if you're from Louisiana or not. I lived there for 7 or 8 years. There's some other major challenges, but in terms of relationships, whites, Black, the ones you have, they're genuine. They're pretty solid. Okay. Then on the East Coast, that probably opened my eyes a little bit more from the standpoint of when I worked in New York, in Manhattan, there, I always looked at things as white and Black. There it was, Polish, German, Russian, Puerto Rican, Jamaica. It wasn't so much white, Black as it was, what nation or nationality that they had, or what have you. But it got me to really thinking about things totally in terms of how I was maybe influenced or by the way I was raised and how I saw things and so forth. So I think that, like what you're saying, I think that hate, there's an emotion, okay? And I think that emotion spurs action, whether it's a positive action or a negative action, it's an action, okay? Understanding you're sitting back, you're patient, you're thinking things through, and there's not that trigger of excitement or emotionalism to maybe make you want to get up and do something right then and there, kind of like what the George Floyd killing did. So it's kind of my thoughts.
Thank you for sharing that, Joe. Yeah, and that resonates. I've lived in Seattle for going on 14 years, but I grew up between Mississippi and Louisiana. My dad's Mexican, my mom is white, and the experience I had growing up, that both my parents have had growing up, are very different than my experiences down here, especially as a non-Black person, have been very different. And the people that are working for social justice, that are working for racial equity, they don't say those things lightly, because down here it costs you something, and sometimes that costs you something physical, right? Your personal safety. So it is always it's almost like time traveling when I'm down here from being in Seattle, growing up here, being in Seattle, coming back down, and then eventually coming back to Seattle again. It always just reinforces that. We talk about this in the cohort a lot of like, what are you willing to risk? How is your solidarity actionable? How is it tangible? Someone in the film, I think it was a former principal, was like, people talk about, yes, all that is so good, but don't bring your kids to our school. Don't when I'm asked to give up something, I'm asked to share power, or even more, give up power. People aren't interested in that. Black Lives Matter unless XYZ, right? Natalya, I heard you. I saw you shake. Heard you. I saw you shaking your head when Joe was kind of sharing about that being like an ethnicity specific thing in New York. I wondered if you had anything to chime in on that.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, Joe. I didn't really even think about that, but you're totally right. When I think back to my childhood, yeah, everything was very much your origin. Where'd you come from? Because people in New York are thought of as people who come from somewhere else, even if it's from a different part of the country. Yes, everybody's a New Yorker and there's a New Yorker type, but still it's like kind of where you come from. But I also wanted to say that understand, hate, like Joe was saying, hate is an emotion, hate's a feeling, but hate is also like personal, right? Understanding is you have to listen. Right? It's not about you, right? You need to sit and listen and experience and have empathy and just be patient, right? Whereas hate can come very, very quickly. And so understanding is just more complex by its own definition. And it can be very, very difficult to understand when someone's coming from a different culture, a different space, even a different place in this country, right? There's, like Joe was saying, every place he went the culture was a little different. How people related to each other was a little different. So I think we always need to take a step back and think, well, okay, I never fully understand the situation. There's always more to understand.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to is just like the discomfort that is required in anti-racism work for white folks, in anti-horizontal oppression work for folks of color. Like there's discomfort that we have to sit through. BIPOC folks, we harm each other too. We have our own stuff that we have to navigate and we have to work through. Like, how do we horizontally oppress and harm one another? And like, and for white folks too, like working through like anti-racism is a lifelong journey, right? It doesn't mean that if we do or say something that's anti-horizontally oppressive, or that is or that is harmful, or that is racist, that equals us being bad people. But that just means that we all have work that we need to do, right? And that discomfort is not something that us as humans are like, yeah, I'm gonna sign up for that. I'm gonna sign up to be really uncomfortable for my own growth. I'm curious, Leah and Quincy, do you, my experience watching the generation below me is people people are really open to like, yes, let's have this conversation, or like, oh my gosh, why did you even ask my pronouns? Like, obviously that's like a normal thing. Like, why is that weird? Just things that don't seem like a big deal anymore, which is refreshing. And then also my mind, I'm like, wait, what? You don't need to process this? What? When you hear that quote, that hate is easier to organize than understanding, what is your experience of that in your own communities? Does that feel true, or does that seem like a different generation's problem?
Yeah, so I would say that hate is definitely something that's simpler to come across than truly understanding the person that you were maybe opposing with. I think this is something that's really prominent with Generation Z, especially when you talk about cancel culture. I think cancel culture is something that is the definition of hating somebody and not understanding. For example, somebody may tweet something that's, hey, that's not morally acceptable, or you're not up to date. Like, people don't give them a chance to have an understanding of why that wasn't okay and go back to kind of where that may have gone wrong. They instead say, get out, you're done, all these different things. And it makes it so that person isn't having the opportunity to learn and grow from there. And I think that's a really, really big problem with Generation Z and maybe even generations before, but especially in the day and age of technology, where you can literally reach anyone anytime in the world, and you also have the chance to be stuck in your own social bubble. And I think that's very, very crucial. So to me, I would say it's quite simple, really, especially when you talk about cancel culture. I think it's something that's really prominent and definitely needs to be talked about, especially within this generation. And how it could really affect the types of conversations that we have, especially if you're canceling other people and saying they're not a part of this community. That really makes it difficult and makes it so it's just like, I'll cancel this person before they cancel me. And it's just a cycle in and of itself.
Yeah, and really easy to do on things like social media. I mean, it's easy to write a comment or make a post, or it's not, I don't think there's a lot of opportunity for us to engage with folks like that in a way that is rooted in restorative justice principles of like, I believe in your capacity to take ownership of what you said or what you did because it was harmful. I believe in your capacity to like hear me out. And we don't always like, that's not available in those spaces, or we don't want to do the work to like create that. It's much easier, kind of to the point of the quote, it's easier to just be like, you're done, we cancel, you're not a part of this community anymore. Yeah. What about for you, Quincy?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Leah said. I guess I can kind of talk a little bit more about within my own social circles in Roosevelt with what I've noticed. I think that a lot of it is, yeah, obviously, as we said, as we've agreed on, like hate is a lot easier to just kind of spread. It spreads like a wildfire. I kind of think of it as like, you're someone lights a match and then it's like the hate is like brush fire. It's like brush, like it just lights on fire. And especially with social media, I think that's how it is. And yeah, understanding is a lot more difficult to attain. And I think that within Roosevelt, within my community, I've noticed that there's this kind of performative aspect to understanding, which is not necessarily restorative, where it's like you're kind of putting on this act to not for understanding and to benefit other people and to be altruistic, but simply to make the impression that you are someone who is understanding, which I think is really an issue. And it really just comes down to, like we said, like I think Joe said, or Natalya, it really comes down to, I think it's Natalya, listening to the other person and being open-minded. Those two things, listening and being open-minded, because there's only so much that a mask can do, right? When it really comes down to it, if you're put into a situation and you don't have much time your first instinct is to do whatever is behind that mask. So if you have time to deliberate, like on social media, right, you can take as much time as you want to make a post. In real life, you can't do that. You have to either say something or not say something or say something else. So that's really where it comes down to, how can we have that deeper connection and understanding in daily life?
Thanks for engaging and thinking through that that question. It's on my mind a lot. I think especially just being in the South again too, and then with the elections, and just thinking about how do we push and have conversations where we get people who are willing to have that conversation, who are willing to sit through that discomfort, and work. And for a lot of us, we might have people in our life that will never happen. We may have people in our life that it'll take a while for them to get there. But was just curious to hear all of your perspective on like, how do we approach that? And kind of to what you were saying, Quincy, there are a couple of other like quotes that stood out to me. Someone in the film had pointed out that Seattle has the 5th worst opportunity gap in the country, yet we are one of the fastest growing economies. We also learned in the film that Seattle was the last city to adopt the open house ordinance. And that was only after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I think these both manifest this Seattle nice sentiment, this quiet racism that isn't in your face. This whole, it's all good unless it impacts me behavior. That, when I heard those and I read those, it didn't seem very different than what we saw in 2020. Things as small as, Band-Aid being like, we are inclusive. We now make Band-Aids of different colors. Like it took George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery for Band-Aids to make things like that seem trivial and small, or people saying, hey, Black Lives Matter, we're Black in our social media, we're taking the day off to reflect and think about that. That's a whole nother conversation for a different time. Let's not get started on that. Because I'm sure our conversation will take a turn, and which maybe, I don't know, maybe we should talk about that. But when we go back and we ask organizations or individuals, what have you done for Black liberation? Black Lives Matter, have you talked about the impact of policing, the negative impact or disproportionate impact of policing on Black communities? No, that's too political, or no, that makes me uncomfortable. And I find that so interesting because those same kind of sentiments and comments that were made a long time ago don't seem that different than what we are experiencing today. And Leah, you said something, in the film that that all of these speak to, and that there's performative and there's reformative. They're different words, they're different experiences. And I'm curious, and Leah, I'll start with you, of like, how do we shift performative to reformative, especially when we are in Seattle's in a predominantly white city. Arts and culture organizations are predominantly white institutions. People who are in positions of power, especially at schools that are not in the South End, have more access to power, more access to resources. How do we hold people in those positions accountable to doing that work? How do we shift from performative to reformative?
I think the shift from performative to reformative it's really difficult because there is symbolic and then there's material. And I think that's important to have an aspect where you're balancing both of those. Essentially what we have with social media and the movements that we have, particularly when it comes to that, is mostly just symbolic work. We're symbolizing this is what we value and this is what we want, but there's no material kind of backup and action to it. I think that's what we're really at a loss at. I don't think performative versus reformative, I don't think it's more a mutually exclusive relationship. I think it's something that works together. Establishing your moral standing and your moral obligations, that's something that's important. I think that's important to showcase, but not without that action, not without that pairing. I don't think performative and reformative action are something that are mutually exclusive concepts. I think they work together in a sense that when they are done correctly, it is something that is it's better for the community. And I think that when we have these types of conversations of moving away from performative to reformative in that sense, I think we need to talk about what we're doing and what we have been doing, what we want to do. And I think all of this really starts with youth to me. It starts with the educational system and it starts with youth and how we are going to teach them the essential tools and frameworks to make our society better. Because quite honestly, when people get older, they get stuck in their ways. And we see that in the people who we have in office, they get stuck in their ways. And I think it's really essential that we, make it very, very clear and that we have our legislative body that is, I think maybe an average age of like 50 to 45, and then the voting population is way younger than that. So it's really interesting that there's such a disparity. And I think that really starts with youth having their voices heard and making the future that they want, but not without that intergenerational aspect. but I think that it's just really important to talk about in the spaces. If youth want to make changes, then they need to know how to actually make those efficient changes. And I think that's just education and talking with the communities that you're trying to help, because without talking to them, you're not going to know how to help them 100%. There's been many policies that have been made that don't actually help the communities that they are meant to help. And that is the most sad and tragic thing ever. So, yeah. And also, I believe Quincy talked about performative versus reformative as well, because I'd like to pass it to you.
Yeah, Quincy, I'm gonna pass it to you. And then I have a follow-up for both of you to answer, and then we'll go to the older, wiser I'm kidding. The older folks on the go to Joe and Natalya. Go ahead, Quincy.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with everything Leah said. Can you repeat the question, Elena?
Yeah. It's because I was babbling before I asked it. So
No,
how do we
it's okay.
shift? How do we shift from performative to reformative? How do we shift from things just being like, hey, look at me, to like there being some tangible action?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Leah said. I guess I can talk more about reformative. I think involves a lot of what I've noticed is that um, sometimes there's kind of this within social justice communities, you know, whether it's something like this, a conversation, an organization, right? I think there's just a lot of moving pieces. And one thing that I've noticed is it's hard to manage those pieces and kind of move past the, obviously, like Leah said, like moving past the conversational and idealization stage and kind of moving into that action stage. And to do that action, like there's a lot of different specialties. There's a lot of different people that need to come together, form an understanding, and then, as Leah said, understand the community, understand the problem they're trying to solve. And that is just a massive challenge. And the issue, I think, is that we don't really have a framework for doing that that's really effective, because yes, there's social media, but what's the issue with social media? You don't have that, you don't have the understanding. It's mainly ideas. There's not really a whole lot of action going on. There's fundraising. That's one thing that's been added to Instagram recently that's useful, but you know, there's a lot more that can be done outside of social media. So I think it's really a matter of pulling together, you know, people that specialize in business, that specialize in community outreach, all of these different disciplines, and create a multidisciplinary, it's a fancy word, impact. And I think that's really what will actually make a lasting impact.
Thank you for sharing that, Quincy. I really appreciate that.
I want to just touch on something that Leah said, which I think is very important, and that is you have, I'll say, individuals that are old like me, and Natalya is much younger than I am, so I don't want you to group her with me, but we have a tendency of knowing the answer, how to fix it. Okay, and so what we do is we look down at these groups and we say, I know what's wrong with you. Here's what you need to do. Here's the money, and here, do it my way, versus what Leah was saying, getting into the weeds, so to speak, and really understanding the root cause of some of the things that the people are going through, and then working with them to develop solutions to the issues that they have, versus coming with this pot of ideas, and even with the money in some cases, and throw it on them and say, do it my way.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Joe. I mean, I think it's, again, this is why I think it's beautiful to have that interdisciplinary, multifaceted, multicultural, intergenerational conversation, because again, there are going to be perspectives that we bring that because of our lived experience and how we move about the world, we just don't know. Leah, are you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to add one more thing on that point. One thing that I think is really helps combat the narrative of what Joe was talking about with like here's the money. I want you to do it my way. I think participatory budgeting is something that's very, very helpful, especially for close-knit communities where you have people have these set amount of funds and they allocate it the way that they see fit for their specific community. So you have people taking it into their own hands and really deciding what they want is best for their community. I think that is something that is so essential and that can really help with the amount of disparities that we see and not adequate funding in the places that people need it the most. So I think it's something that's really, really helpful, especially when you have people who are elected who are out of touch with the areas that they represent. I think that's really essential. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, it's important. I'm glad that you did. You know, all the power to the people. The people should be making their own decisions around how they want to be cared for and governed. And when you're out of touch and you're not from that community, you don't have those experiences, you don't have those relationships, it's really hard to make those decisions. When you're not centering, whose voices are you centering? Are you centering you and your power, or are you centering the needs of the communities that are that have elected you and put you there? There's 2 questions in the chat that I want to get to, and then y'all, we got to honor. Listen, I don't want Joe's wife mad at me or anybody else. He's got a date. He's sticking to it. His wife of 43 years, so we're not going to mess it up now. We have to be done on time. So we'll Natalya, maybe you can speak to this question. And I was just going to say before I ask this question, just going back to that reformative, and this idea of making statements and making tangible. I also think it's really important for, you know, when we saw in that movement, a lot of people made statements. Okay, from here on, that's what we're going to talk about. What I wish would have happened, especially with organizations that, you know, corporations, people that got called out, was that there would have been some kind of taking ownership of, you know what, we exist in a white supremacy culture and we have upheld that in our organization or our company or our school. We have caused harm because of racism. We want to acknowledge that. Here are the ways that we think we want to make amends. We want to connect with the people that we've harmed. Does that feel good? Is that going to take more work? Absolutely, it's going to take more work. But I think for a lot of people that maybe we saw maybe who were a part of that cancel culture, didn't approach it in that way. So then it led to people being like, you know what? I don't have any space for you. I don't have any more time for you. My trauma is speaking for itself now. And unless there's an opportunity for you to take ownership of the ways in which you've harmed me or harmed my community or whatever, we don't just get to say, oh, well, that happened in the past. We're going to be an anti-racist org now. So here we go. Right. And I think that that's part of that, part of your reformative work, part of that performative being connected is like people, individuals, companies, organizations need to acknowledge when there has been previous harm and to be accountable to that also. So somebody put in the chat, and maybe Natalya, you can speak to this a little bit. I'm curious about any legislation or larger scale changes maybe pending that can help distribute funding differently for schools than based on local taxes, and how the PTSA groups could work together so there's less disparity between schools. I don't know if you have any. You kind of talked about that in this a little bit too.
Yeah, I did a little bit. That's a great question. I get that question a lot. So I'll start with a couple of kind of facts. One fact is that actually Washington State funds education pretty equitably, well, pretty equally from school to school. Most of the funding for schools actually comes from the state, not from your local tax money. And actually about 49% of the state budget is devoted to pre-K through college education. However, that said, there is still a lot of local money that flows into schools. So there is school districts are allowed to raise a little bit of money from their own property tax levies or bonds, depending on the region of the state. And so definitely Seattle kind of has a little bit of advantage there. However, that's the amount that can be raised is limited significantly by the state. So Our district is actually quite limited in the amount of money that it can raise through local property taxes. And it was written like that in the legislature. And so that creates some challenges for our school district, because our school district is fairly diverse, and we have a kind of a large number of high poverty schools. And so it becomes a little bit difficult for us to provide for those schools in a better way. And then the other way that funding can come into schools is through parent organizations. So there's PTAs, but there's also other parent organizations. There's booster groups. So one thing that it's really important to know is that the state funds a basic education. And what is not part of a basic education is all of that extra stuff that our kids love to do, is art and music, extra kind of engineering type sciences. None of that, the only funding, for instance, at Roosevelt that we get for those programs, even though Roosevelt's very well known for its theater and music programs, we get the teacher salaries for those programs. That's it. If you want to do sports, you get some money for coaches, but that's it. You don't get money for jerseys. You don't get money for the footballs or the soccer balls or the lacrosse. So the way that we've set up the funding, we have actually encouraged parents at the school to fund those things. So that if we want to see some of those disparities go away, we need to fund those things that we term as extra and not part of a basic education. And in terms of PTSA funding, just really quickly, PTSAs are actually having conversations about distributing their funds in a more equitable way. And there are even some that are doing it right now. It's really difficult to do that because each PTSA is its own nonprofit organization. And so those mission statements would have to be rewritten. And because right now, the way they're written is that those PTSAs are created as organizations to support their school. And so we can't just take all of that money that we collect and send it all away to other places. We still have to use it predominantly in our own schools. It's also important to remember that even if we took all the PTSA money in the entire school district of Seattle and gave it to Seattle Public Schools, it would be just a drop in the bucket for the deficits that the school district is going to be experiencing going forward. So PTSA money isn't going to solve the problem. It's a much larger problem. I think where PTSAs can actually be really powerful is in advocacy, is in trying to create that change that brings equity to our schools.
Thank you for sharing that and giving us some insight into that. There are things that I didn't know about that either, and how our taxes are broken down. And I'd love to be able to spend more time on that and have more conversations around, well, what does that work look like, especially legislatively? And maybe there's some follow-up we can do after this. I had one more question, Joe. I'm going to pass it to you if you have one more minute. And then if you need to hop off, that's totally cool, and other folks can answer. But April was, she just said, thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. I'm curious if you have any calls to action for any post-high school transplants like myself. How do we not feed into the continued systems of redlining and inequities in Seattle neighborhoods?
I always say, these racism and prejudice and biases are really pretty simple. If you get to the core of it, and I would say, know yourself. Get to know yourself. A lot of the racism, prejudice comes out of fear and ignorance about the person, and insecurities about who you are. If you're secure about who you are, okay, then it doesn't make any difference what other people say, do, or whatever. Okay, so I would say start with knowing yourself, understanding that you have certain biases and prejudice, okay, that you may or may not know, that you're not perfect in terms of what it is, okay, and then from there, you could join a group, an organization, great, if that's what it is, but find other like-minded individuals like yourself, okay, that are willing to learn and grow about people that are different in whatever ways it is, but people that are different. Okay. And then that 2 becomes 4, and that 4 becomes 8. And you'll start there, unless you can find the organization that, again, that'll allow you to be who you are and allow you to grow if you're not quite where everyone else is there, and so forth. So it's it's a journey. I'm 69 years old, and I'm still on a journey. I'm still learning. I have prejudices, biases, and whatever, and I try to understand why I have them. And sometimes I have to catch myself. Okay, I've got to be, what were we talking about before? I've got to be more understanding, okay, than emotional. And so I have to step back and try to understand and assess everything around me. But I guess that would be the advice I would give you. Know thyself. Okay, and be strong in what you know about yourself, and no one can dictate to you or tell you or change you or whatever. But that's what I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. Quincy or Leah, do either of you have any like tangible cause to actions? Like, hey, you can support this organization or join this group, kind of like Joe was sharing.
One thing I would just add is to Joe's point of like joining an organization. If an organization that you find in your area does not meet your needs and your wants for your society, create your own. Just end of story. Just create your own. Be bold, be creative. I think whatever space you're in, I don't know if you, like April, if you're in college right now, but really like there's so many opportunities to create a student organization. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to get your voice heard. Not only that, you can create change, but also like it looks great if you like ever want to go to like law school or something like that, like or get a PhD like Natalya. So yeah, I would definitely say that. Get your voice heard in whatever aspect, whether that be voting, all that.
Spoken like someone who has plans to go to law school. That's smart. Quincy, you want to add in on there?
No, I don't really have much to add. I would say, yeah, get a PhD. I don't know. Yeah, I guess that will help you.
You're good. You're good. That's all. Do you have anything to add on that point?
I would say explore. Go around the city. I mean, that's something that my husband and I did. Well, he wasn't my husband then, but when we moved out here, we made a real effort just out of curiosity to go and explore the different neighborhoods in the city and see what's happening there. Go out to eat or go to the playground, go to the park. I mean, even when we had kids, we used to go to playgrounds in all different parts of the city, and it was really interesting to see who was in what playground, right? I found that to be really fascinating. And now when people talk about places in my city where I don't live, I have like, some mental map of that place of where whatever it is, the thing has happened. And sometimes it's even interesting just to drive through the city and just see how everything changes a little bit by little as you go through all the different neighborhoods. COVID was really great for that too. COVID was awful, but we went for walks in all different parts of the city, and explored all the different nooks and crannies everywhere, and just see what a rich and vibrant city we live in. Rich in culture, rich in money too, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for all of your all the wisdom you've shared tonight. And yeah, I think on that point is like it kind of goes back. We talk about this in the cohort a lot too, of like what relationships do you have with people? Not just like how do we make sure that as organizations that we're not tokenizing people. And you can tokenize people by paying them too. I always tell people, pay them for their time. You can still tokenize them. So like, be mindful of how you're going to engage in that relationship with them. Have you ever even talked to that person before you ask them to be on your Black History Month panel, right? Like, are you uplifting Black artists all the time? Or is this something you only do in February? Even if you're paying someone, that can still be tokenizing, right? So like, what are the relationships that you have with people and with communities? Do you know their name? Do you get coffee with them? Do you know their birthday? Like just things that you know about your friends. Are you in communities with these people? And I just, I appreciate so much just all the perspectives that you all have brought and that Joe has brought. And thank you for spending time with us and sharing your wisdom. I know this won't be the last time that we partner and get together, or I hope that it won't be, and that Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism can partner with R.A.R.E and supporting the work that you're doing too, and being able to take the things that we learned and that you shared here back to our organizations, back to our community. We need more youth-centered, youth-focused work in our arts and culture organizations, in the opera, in the ballet, in music, at SIF, all of those things. We really need to have more youth-oriented programming, because it might sound cheesy, but youth are the future, and you are a part of the voting class now, which is important. Thank goodness you can vote now. Almost, Quincy, right? 18, almost. Oh my goodness, here comes my cat again. Thank you all again so much for being here and participating. Everybody have a wonderful evening. We'll be sure to put this on the website so you can watch the panel discussion, or to share that after folks have watched the film. And take really good care, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Quincy.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Lynn.
Natalya. Good night. Bye, everyone.